Some thoughts arrive not like memories, but like echoes from a place the soul still kneels. You're walking through your day. Then suddenly, without reason, they're there. In a glance, in a song, in the hush between one breath and the next. Why? Because this isn't just rumination. It's not madness. It's not weakness. It's the soul returning, not to reopen the wound, but to kneel before it once more, to listen to what was never said, to hold the part of you that still waits in the silence. Carl Jung wrote, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain," and Bruce Lipton teaches us that what is not healed, the body remembers, not just in thought, but in frequency. Unresolved bonds reverberate inside us, like the haunting sound of a cathedral bell that never stopped ringing. So when you think of them, again, this isn't a sign you haven't healed. It's an invitation, not to forget, but to remember differently. This video is not here to tell you to let go. It is here to sit with you in the sacred wound and ask, what is it within you that still calls through their image? Because maybe, just maybe, thinking of them is not a detour. It's the beginning of the deepest return. Some wounds do not bleed. They remain hidden beneath the surface, pulsing quietly like a forgotten melody. Perhaps you loved without being seen. Perhaps you stayed open in a moment when the other chose to turn away. And now, long after their presence has gone, something in you still stands at the door, waiting for a gaze that never arrived, for a word that was never said. That person may no longer walk your path, but the moment of rupture remains frozen in your soul, like a page in a book that was never turned. Carl Jung understood this. The psyche is not linear. It returns again and again to the place where the story was interrupted. Not because you're broken, but because your soul refuses to abandon what still needs to be completed. Bruce Lipton reminds us, the body remembers. Every moment of unmirrored pain lives in your cells, like a frequency that keeps playing beneath your thoughts. No matter how much time has passed, the vibration persists because what wasn't felt wasn't finished. You see, this is not about them anymore. It's about you. That sacred wound holds the part of you that was never named. It carries the version of you who was still soft, still hopeful, still unguarded. And your soul, in its infinite wisdom, returns not to suffer, but to retrieve what was left behind. This wound is not a flaw. It is a map. And every time it aches, it calls you back, to feel, to witness, to hold what no one else could. This is not about moving on. It's about moving inward. Let go and move on. How many times have these words been offered, like bandages to a soul that is still bleeding beneath? But what if letting go is not always a sign of maturity? What if it's sometimes a mask, a soft repression disguised as transcendence? There are wounds that do not want to be discarded, not because you are clinging to pain, but because something within that moment remains unresolved, unheard, unloved. Bruce Lipton speaks of cellular memory, how trauma etches itself not only into thought, but into the very vibration of your being. You may convince your mind to forget, but the body, wise and ancient, continues to remember. And so, when the thought of them returns, it's not necessarily resistance, it may be resonance. Carl Jung would not see this as weakness. He would see it as the unconscious pulling us back into the mythic thread, into the symbolic place where we lost part of ourselves. True maturity does not rush to release. It listens. It waits in the space where the pain still breathes. It asks, what have I not yet held with tenderness? There is a difference between releasing and silencing. Silencing creates numbness, but true release comes only after presence, after feeling the full echo, after letting the memory stretch across your soul like twilight. Letting go, then, is not forgetting. It is seeing the memory differently, not as something to erase, but as something that shaped the way your soul loves. And when that shift happens, you don't need to let go, because it no longer holds you. It becomes part of you. There is a silence that follows the end of a connection, but sometimes that silence speaks louder than words. You try to move forward, but their image returns. Not just in dreams, but in subtle moments, a familiar scent, a phrase spoken by a stranger, a pause that feels like their presence. And you ask yourself, why can't I stop thinking about them? But perhaps the question isn't, why can't I forget? But what is being remembered through them? Carl Jung taught that the unconscious does not speak in logic. It speaks in symbols, in repetition. And Bruce Lipton would say that frequencies from past emotional imprints continue to vibrate until their resonance is fully felt. So maybe it's not obsession. Maybe it's a message, not from them, but from the part of you that was most alive in their presence. The thought might be returning not to reopen the wound, but to remind you of who you were when your heart was still exposed, when your soul dared to feel without armor. They may no longer be the meaning, but their memory may still be the messenger. The soul has its own ways of calling us inward. Sometimes it speaks in dreams, other times through the face we cannot forget, not to keep us tethered to the past, but to carry us toward the part of ourselves that we left behind when love turned into silence. You are not broken. You are in a mythic cycle of remembering, a return not to the other, but to the sacred place within, where your voice once trembled with truth. There are wounds that don't scream. They whisper, not in pain, but in the quiet fatigue that colors your mornings, in the breath you hold without knowing, in the joy that feels just slightly out of reach. Many women carry the weight of a memory they believe they should have buried. Why am I still thinking of him? Shouldn't I be over this by now? And so, shame begins to speak where the soul once tried to. But guilt does not dissolve grief. It only buries it deeper, where it ferments into something heavier, anxiety that has no name, emotional numbness that silences the music inside. Carl Jung would say that what is not made conscious returns as fate, and Bruce Lipton reminds us that suppressed emotions are stored not only in thought, but in tissue, in vibration, in breath. Ignoring a sacred wound does not heal it. It camouflages it, until one day it resurfaces not as memory, but as a persistent sense of disconnection. You start to forget how it felt to be fully present. You start to doubt the authenticity of your own emotions, not because you've failed, but because you've unknowingly silenced the part of you that still needs to speak. To turn away from the wound is to slowly unwrite yourself, because in that ache is a fragment of your story, still pulsing with truth. The soul does not seek closure, it seeks integration, and integration can only come through presence, the sacred act of sitting beside what still aches without rushing it into silence. The cost of ignoring the sacred wound is forgetting the sound of your own soul. Imagine your soul as a cathedral, a sacred, intricate structure built not only by joy, but by every love that passed through you. Each connection, each departure, etched its own color into the stained glass of your being. Some left light, others cracks. But there is one window, the one they touched, that remains shattered. It wasn't replaced, it was left just as it broke, as if even the pain itself had to be remembered. And now, when the sun hits that window in a certain way, something extraordinary happens. The crack does not distort the light, it refracts it, turning pain into prism, turning absence into glow. Carl Jung would understand this metaphor as the individuation process, where the wound becomes the place through which wholeness is made possible. Bruce Lipton would affirm that the body and energy field do not forget, that the way light filters through trauma changes how we resonate, how we feel, how we love again. So the goal is not to erase what broke. It is to see how that fracture now holds the sacred geometry of everything you became in the aftermath. Because healing is not about restoring perfection. It is about embracing the sacred asymmetry of who you are. Your cathedral stands, not despite the crack, but because of it. Sometimes, What you see is not them. It's the version of them that your heart needed, the one who would stay, understand, and reflect back the love you offered in silence. And that version may have never truly existed, at least not outside of you. Carl Jung taught us that we project the unloved parts of ourselves onto others, especially onto those who touched our soul during a vulnerable season. We don't just fall in love with a person, we fall in love with the mirror they unknowingly held up to the child within us. That child, still tender, still unseen, uses their image as a language. It speaks not in logic, but in longing. Bruce Lipton would remind us that emotional memories stored in early life create patterns that later return, not as problems, but as portals to deeper recognition. So maybe when you think of them, you're not remembering the adult version of a relationship. You're remembering the place where your inner child thought, maybe this time I will finally be chosen. Their memory becomes more than nostalgia. It becomes a sacred mirror, held up by a younger version of you, asking if now, perhaps, you are ready to see what was missing all along. This is not regression, it is revelation. Because when we stop blaming ourselves for the image we once projected, we begin to hold that child within, with gentleness, with eyes that say, I see you now. And in that seeing, the image softens. The pain begins to speak, and the soul begins to integrate what was once exiled in silence. Did you enjoy the content and it made a difference for you? Click on Super Thanks and support our work. For 10 years she dreamed of him, always the same image, always the same silence. In the dream he stood by a window, never speaking, never leaving, just watching, as if guarding something forgotten. Therapists called it fixation. Friends said she needed to move on. But her soul knew something else was happening. Carl Jung believed that when a symbol repeats with such insistence, it is not a sign of psychological error, but of spiritual initiation. Bruce Lipton might say that the vibrational field of that connection held a frequency so precise, so intimate, that it continued to echo within her nervous system, long after the physical bond dissolved. One day, instead of resisting the dream, she sat with it, not asking why he returned, but what within her was returning through him. And that's when she saw it. He was not the destination. He was the door. Through his image, she encountered the part of herself that had once written poetry, that had once wept freely, that had once believed in beauty without needing a reason. He represented the gate to her lost vulnerability, to a softness the world had taught her to suppress. And so the dreams changed, not because she forced herself to forget, but because she finally remembered. She wasn't stuck. She was being called, not to go back to him, but to go forward through herself. Because initiation doesn't always come in fire. Sometimes it comes as a face that won't leave your memory until you reclaim the part of your soul that first loved through it. There are moments when the thought of them returns not like a memory, but like a key turning softly in a hidden door. You feel it in your chest, in your breath, in the hush that follows their name. And something inside opens, not outward, but inward. What if that thought is not a chain, but a threshold? Carl Jung would say that the psyche seeks completion through image, ritual, and remembrance. And Bruce Lipton affirms that transformation must occur not just mentally, but energetically, cellularly, soulfully. So when their memory arrives, instead of turning away, you might simply pause, not to act, but to listen. One hand on the heart, the other on the belly, where your breath first formed when you were still untouched by the world. Not to invoke them, but to ask the only question that matters now. What part of myself is asking to be remembered through this thought? Not a closure, not a goodbye, but a letter, not to them, but to the version of you who once loved them. The woman who stayed soft, the one who waited in silence, the one who knew how to dream in their direction before knowing how to protect herself. Write not to release them, but to retrieve her. This is not forgetting. It is integration. It is the transformation of the thought into a doorway and of the pain into a passage. The sacred wound does not disappear, but now it begins to glow from within. Perhaps the thoughts were never intrusions. Perhaps they were quiet rituals. The soul's way of asking you to return, not to them, but to where you last felt the truth of who you were becoming. Carl Jung reminds us that healing is not the removal of pain. It is the weaving of meaning into what once felt meaningless. Bruce Lipton teaches that for something to truly transform, it must be felt not only in the mind, but in the vibration of the body, where memories live like forgotten songs, waiting for harmony. So maybe the pain was not a blockage. Maybe it was a compass, a sting that points you inward, toward the sacred, toward the unfinished, toward the whole. This is not where your story ended. This is where you begin again, with the part of yourself you once left behind, now walking beside you. If you made it this far, comment, "Estoy despierta." Let the echo become a collective whisper, a remembrance that you were never alone in this.